So I think we have the recording going now. So Tossin Mehdi is a senior research economist in the Social Analysis and Modeling Division of Statistics Canada. His research focuses on labor and the measurement of socioeconomic well-being. He's a former OECD economist and has a PhD in economics from the University of Portsmouth. He also has a University of Guelph connection. He was a research assistant at U of G from 2010 to 2014 in the Department of Economics and Finance. So we're very excited to welcome Tossin back virtually. And obviously he's welcome to come in person anytime he wants as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tossin.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kevin. And yeah, thanks a lot for having me. So I'm a labor economist from Statistics Canada, and my work in part sort of involves trying to understand and measure the impact of technological disruptions on the labor market. So whether it's telework, ever since COVID, I've looked a lot into that. And lately, obviously, it's been a lot of AI, these new tools. Um, so AI, generative AI especially, has really sort of taken off over the past couple of years, ever since the release of ChatGPT. Since then, of course, we now have somewhat of an AI boom where different AI models try to one up the previous one. Um, AI is already sort of starting to have an impact on the broader society, but our research, my research with my colleague Renee Morissette, who's also a labor economist, it's more about trying to answer questions about the potential impact of AI on the Canadian job market, labor market. So we're looking to answer questions like how many workers could be impacted, what kind of jobs could be affected, and so on. Um, while we can make sort of theoretical assessments regarding which tasks can and cannot be potentially done by AI, we simply don't know much about how AI adoption by businesses might look like in the future, that might scale up, or if it'll scale up at all, and how workers and government policies might adapt to these changing sort of times. So just to set the tone here, technological progress, it's a key pillar of economic development and always has been. As sort of technology improves, it might take over some jobs or certain tasks within jobs and allow workers to focus on more cognitive goals, tasks requiring creativity and sort of critical thinking. This process can lead to job destruction, of course, but it can also lead to job creation because new technologies require a new set of skills to be able to work with them and people who know how to work with them. So economists sort of see this process as a means to achieving economic growth and higher productivity, essentially. AI just happens to be the latest example of disruptive technology, but it's not new, actually. So the term artificial intelligence was actually coined back in the 1950s. What's new now is sort of the rapid pace of development and the progression. Emerging technologies always raise concerns, of course, about the future of work. We've seen this with automation, which has impacted workers in the past, especially those who perform sort of simple and routine tasks, like repetitive tasks in their jobs. We have machines which can do their tasks faster and produce more outputs per hour. So some of these jobs get replaced by machines completely. But unlike previous waves of technological advancements, AI might actually be different because sort of it has the potential to affect a broader segment of the workforce, given its growing capacity to perform complex, non-routine, and cognitive tasks. AI is a rapidly evolving concept. It has a growing list of things it can do, so it's hard to come up with a clear definition of what it is, but we can kind of think of it as basically any technology capable of mimicking the human brain, essentially. People often conflate AI with automation, but they are different concepts from a measurement perspective. Automation is really the use of technology and machines to do simple, repetitive, and non-cognitive tasks. So think of machines in factories, which keep doing the same things over and over again, but much faster than humans. So that's automation. AI, on the other hand, is dynamic. It can adapt to changes. It takes training data. It learns constantly. It interprets and analyzes them, runs millions of calculations, models in the background, and then comes in up with an output, which is what you see as the final product. Um, we simply don't know much about the breadth of its potential. So at best, we can describe it for now as sort of a mix of uncertainty and opportunity. So there is obviously a lot of hype around AI. Some people are comparing it to previous technological milestones, like the invention of the PC, which actually led to net job creation. But it's far too early to say whether AI will be as transformational or groundbreaking as some of the earlier technologies. But sort of in terms of who's impacted by new technologies, historically, it tends to affect lower skilled jobs more than higher skilled ones. A clear example of this is automation. My colleagues actually released a study a few years ago, I think in 2020, looking at the potential implications of automation on the Canadian labor market. They found that around 11% of Canadian workers are at high risk of automation, which means their job has a 70% chance or greater of becoming automated in the future. But this risk increases to 33% for workers without any formal education. But there is more uncertainty about AI though, because it has the potential to affect higher skill jobs now. This is not unheard of because if we go way, way back in time, something like the invention of the calculator actually led to a reduction in the demand for accountants, which is an example of a highly skilled job getting a reduction in demand because of a new piece of technology. But still, the question of whether AI will be as revolutionary as some of these earlier technological breakthroughs is an open one. Um, we know that AI can do a lot of things right now, and its capabilities are growing, but will it be as disruptive as the PCs or the internet or even the calculator? Will we actually see widespread deployment of AI across businesses? That remains to be seen. So my colleagues, Renee Morissette, Mark Frenette, and myself at StatCan, we released a couple of studies looking at the potential impact of AI on the Canadian labor market just last year. So measuring the impact of technological transformation is not an exact science, of course. So some decisions and assumptions always need to be made. The most important of which is what measure are we going to use to differentiate jobs exposed to AI from those that aren't? Um, so we use an indicator called the complementarity-adjusted AI occupational exposure score or index, or just the CAIOE for short. It was developed a couple of years ago by some academics from Princeton University and NYU. It was then refined by the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, in 2023, I believe, so 2 years ago, to bring in the complementarity aspect of it. Quite often, when we read studies about the effects of new technologies on the labor market, we tend to sort of focus on who's at risk. But new technologies can also assist and augment productivity and improve workflows and benefit some jobs. And this measure sort of attempts to capture that. That's the complementarity aspect of this measure. So the IMF actually released a report in 2024, just last year, where they looked at the potential impact of AI globally on the global labor markets around the world. But they did not have Canadian data, so that's sort of what inspired our work here. Um, we really have three research questions in mind, or had three research questions in mind. First is which jobs are potentially exposed to AI? Second, which jobs might benefit from AI? And third is who could be impacted by AI? So there are usually winners and losers when looking at economic impact of something. I'll briefly explain how this index works. So it has essentially two components, like I mentioned, exposure and complementarity. So exposure is a measure of the degree to which a job might be exposed to AI. So the potential for AI applications like large language models, LLMs, image pattern recognition software, to do the task you might do in your job. More specifically, it measures the extent to which AI applications might be capable of replicating human abilities, and then that gets weighted by the prevalence and importance of those abilities in a job. I see a hand.
Are you okay with clarifying questions during the presentation, Kevin?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. On the last slide, I was just wondering about when you say which jobs will benefit
hmm
from AI. I could interpret that in many different ways. So I was just wondering, will you talk about what you mean by benefiting? Because it could be like the job, people in that job become more productive, and therefore we have less of those workers in that job, or it could be something like it's about increased like number of positions available in that job. So I just wasn't sure what that meant.
Yeah, I'll definitely get into that.
Okay.
For sure, absolutely. It's a great question. So for this one, yes. So let's see. Yeah, so exposure, it measures the extent to which AI applications might be capable of replicating human abilities, which gets weighted by the prevalence and importance of those abilities in a job. So this is the measure that was developed by Felton et al. In 2022 or 2023, I believe, or yeah, somewhere around there. That's he's a professor at Princeton. So we calculate this for each job occupation and get a number between 0 and 10, with 10 indicating the highest exposure to AI and 0 being the lowest. And I'll get into what that means. So the data for this comes from two sources. The first is something called Amazon Mechanical Turk, or the MTurk survey, which asked tech experts, because that's how usually automation and these technology, these measures work. You have to ask tech experts, industry experts, academics about AI applications and their potential to mimic human abilities. The second is the Occupational Information Network, or which is called ONET, which is an American website maintained by the US Department of Labor. And this is a database that's used a lot by economists. It quantifies the skills and abilities you use across thousands of jobs. So we basically need those ingredients for this index to work. So the second component of this measure, which the IMF introduced, is called complementarity. Now, this is the part that was developed by the obviously the IMF. This is, so to what extent can AI assist you in your job? Can it actually do most of your tasks without your input, or does it still need your supervision? That's kind of what this component of the measure is all about. It looks at 6 dimensions of what's called ONET work contexts. Again, these are going to be numbers assigned on ONET for each job. And it simply takes the average score across those 6 dimensions. So jobs involving more face-to-face communications and those which carry a high burden of responsibility for others can technically feasibly be done by AI, but human oversight would still probably be necessary in these occupations. So to give you a concrete example, think of doctors, nurses, or judges. They make consequential decisions that directly impact other people's lives. So AI can certainly help diagnose diseases, monitor patients, interpret laws, but can AI really do all those things unsupervised without any sort of human intervention? Probably not, or at least we're not there yet. So at least at best, AI can play a complementary role, and that's kind of where this measure is all about. For some workers, it can cut down their workload, but those workers will still be critical for the important decisions. Um, so when you calculate this for each occupation, you'll get a number between 0 and 1, with 1 indicating the highest sort of level of complementarity. This is by no means, of course, meant to be exhaustive. I'm sure there are more things you can imagine which could contribute to this complementarity aspect, like what that means, whether that means job creation or job destruction. But we have to stick with sort of the ONET, our framework database, and this is what's sort of measurable. So that's the IMF framework. So the exposure and complementarity indices can be calculated at the job level from publicly available data from the sources I just mentioned, which are ONET and the MTurk survey. But in order for us to actually measure the impact of AI on workers to say how many or what proportion of workers might be affected, we need a worker level data set like the census to link all those index scores to. So what we do is synthesize all that sort of information and of the various AI applications, their capacity to perform human tasks, and we sort of connect it or link it to the latest census data from 2021, which will allow us to look at sort of the distributional impact across different groups of workers, like who's more likely to be impacted and so on. Now, there are several key limitations to keep in mind. The first one is pretty obvious, as I mentioned, which is that assessing the impact of technological transformation on the economy, it's challenging, it's subjective, it's based on expert judgments regarding just some of the current possibilities of AI. So as AI improves, it's possible that the usefulness of this measure could degrade over time. Because this index doesn't have the capabilities to sort of update itself. You have to do that manually if you really wanted to update the sort of based on the recent advancements of AI. Another limitation is that the measure focuses on generative AI, which is a form of AI that can obviously create new content like text, images, music, videos, based on pre-existing training data and models. But we're not capturing sort of more advanced forms of AI, which can think and act autonomously. So think of advances in self-driving cars or drones, which integrate with AI, with robotics, sensors, and other sort of hardware. That kind of AI has also progressed quite rapidly. But this measure is not sort of capturing those sort of aspects. It's more about generative AI, which is what really is sort of talked about these days. So another limitation is that the exposure is measured at the occupational or job level rather than the individual worker level. This means that we're not capturing the variation in tasks across workers with the same job. So I'm an economist in government. My task may not necessarily be the same as an economist from a bank. Uh, so ONET, which is our main database here, is really meant to reflect the average tasks and responsibilities across jobs. And it does a pretty good job of that. And lastly, perhaps the most important caveat is that employers may not replace workers with AI, even if it's technologically feasible, because of financial, legal, and institutional constraints, which I have a few slides on later on. So exposure to AI doesn't necessarily imply sort of a risk of job loss, but rather it could imply some degree of job transformation. That is, certain tasks within jobs could evolve rather than get replaced completely by technology, since employers may not want to take that risk of completely eliminating workers. And I'll have a few slides on that actually, what employers are doing. So while experts can provide theoretical assessment of what tasks can and cannot be performed by AI, it may not matter if businesses don't actually adopt sort of new technologies. So let's get into the results here. So when we sort of combine these two dimensions of the measure, exposure and complementarity, we get this sort of occupational mapping. It's a simple way for us to conceptualize how AI might impact potentially different jobs. So what you're looking at here are about 500 points, each representing a different occupation, or NOC code, which is the National Occupation Classification System. So using the median scores, we can actually create a grouping of occupations based on their level of exposure and complementarity, just to simplify our lives a little bit. So we're going to call the right half of this chart occupations highly exposed to AI. So that's sort of the framework used by the authors. On the left are what's called low exposure jobs. The right half can be further divided based on their complementarity scores. So the top right quadrant you're looking at can be sort of thought of as, although highly exposed to AI, they might be highly complementary with AI. And they happen to be jobs which require extensive training, like medical professionals and professional engineers. The bottom right quadrant are less complementary with AI. So this group covers a mix of skill levels, everyone from data entry clerks and office support workers, which by the way have been declining occupations well before the advent of AI. But it also has some of the fastest growing occupations like computer programmers. Uh, but less complementary doesn't necessarily imply a risk of job loss. That's not what we're measuring here, as I mentioned earlier. It's more about the possibility of job transformation. So, for example, computer programmers, are less complementary with AI, but I doubt they're getting replaced by AI anytime soon, at least on a wide scale, like at a macroeconomic level, because I'm sure you'll find anecdotal evidence that company A replaced X% of their workforce already with AI, but we're not seeing that right now in our data from monthly labor force surveys that the jobs of coders are actually going down. Because coders, programmers, they're the ones that are developing AI and will probably play a critical role. But tools like ChatGPT, Perplexity, all these tools might play a more intense role for them in the future. And maybe some of their tasks within these jobs could evolve faster, sort of, than in other jobs. Now, yep, question?
Yes,
Right.
hi. This is a super interesting figure. I was wondering if you did any further analyses to look at sex differences in the job. So, like for example, nurses are more female dominated than, let's say, plumbers or carpenters, and see any correlation there.
Yeah, actually, I do have slides which go to the demographic breakdowns of how
Okay.
these different sort of distributions look like. I'll definitely go through that.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Perfect. So before I move on, I just want to make sure I cover low exposure jobs. So they tend to be those in the skilled trades or those which might have less demanding education requirements. So it's more important to note that the high, low exposure and complementarity distinction here that you're looking at, we're not talking in absolute terms. And occupation's only high exposure or high complementarity relative to the median index. It's not an absolute concept. Also, whenever we do these studies looking at the potential impact of technologies on the economy, they're really meant to be at best static snapshots in time based on our current knowledge. So we wrote this paper last year based on an index from 2023. By then, I'm sure a lot has changed, and these occupations are probably might look slightly different now, given how fast AI is growing. So economic dynamics, that's really hard to capture. So jobs less exposed to AI, low exposure. Uh, they're not necessarily immune to technological shocks. They're actually, while they're less exposed to AI, they still face a higher risk of automation compared to sort of highly exposed to jobs to AI. This is because low exposure jobs tend to be those that involve sort of simple, repetitive tasks, and many of them actually require manual physical labor, which may be, while out of reach for generative AI, which is software based, these jobs are more susceptible to automation by machines, and we have seen that in the past. So high risk of automation, I keep talking about that. It means the job, well, at least from the literature, high risk means the job has a probability of 70% or more of becoming automated based on, again, expert data. So this methodology for automation was developed by way back in 2013, and there's a huge long-standing literature already on automation. So it just shows that there are sort of, you can't just look at the labor market through one lens. We can't just focus on AI. We have to remember there are other disruptive forces that are acting on the labor market at any given time. One of them is, of course, automation. So when we link the AI exposure complementarity index to the workers and their occupations from the 2021 census, which of course is one of the richest data sources for studying occupations, workers, we get that around 60% of the Canadian workforce are actually in jobs which might be considered highly exposed to AI. So that's about 8 million workers. But the caveat here is that around half of this group might benefit from AI in some way. So to be more precise, 31% of workers are in high exposure but low complementary jobs, while 29% are in high exposure but high complementary jobs. Again, high exposure is the sum of those two, the low complementarity and high complementarity. So of course that leaves the 40%, and those are in low exposure jobs. And it turns out that this distribution is nearly identical to what the IMF found from the US workforce, which is not surprising because the skills compositions of our Canadian workers and American workers are actually very similar. And even France, Germany, UK, they're about the same breakdown. And of course, when we slice the data by industry, we see a considerable variation, as would be expected. So industries like finance, information, professional, scientific service, which are more sort of tech-oriented, have a greater relative share of jobs which might be highly exposed to, but also less complementary with AI. So presumably there's a lot of software engineering jobs and all sort of systems developers and all these, and which are sort of jobs slated as a low complementary. Healthcare and education tend to have a greater share of jobs like doctors, nurses, teachers, which might be highly complementary with AI due to the sort of in-person nature of their jobs and the criticality of their decisions and their impact on other people's health, their education, and so on. So remember that this index is measured at the job level, occupation level, like I mentioned. So these variations you're seeing are entirely driven by the mix or composition of jobs within industries. And so they don't necessarily reflect the individual skill level. So this is something we typically don't see in the technological transformation studies. But AI is more likely to impact highly skilled jobs, hence highly educated workers face greater exposure to AI. This is essentially an inverse of the result we are used to seeing from the automation studies for the past few decades, which which always conclude that less educated workers are more likely to be impacted. But there is a bit of nuance here with AI though, because while highly educated workers are in jobs which might be more exposed to AI, these jobs also happen to be the ones highly complementary with AI. So this is interesting because historically, the jobs typically held by lower educated workers, which tend to be affected by technology. But with the advent of AI, its growing reach, it's possible that highly or higher educated workers will be impacted as well, but they're also, like I said, more likely to sort of reap the potential benefits of AI. And I will get into a bit more of that in the next few slides. So related to the education dimensions, exposure to AI increases with earnings. So when we rank workers according to their employment income, we get sort of a gradient here, which tells us how exposure and complementarity changes as we move up the earnings ladder. So these are employment income deciles, basically. But exposure to AI is just one side of the story, right? So as you can see, yes, if you focus on decile 10, so that's the top 10% of workers, the vast majority of jobs, if you add up the red and the blue bars, might they're highly exposed to AI, but the vast majority of those jobs, 55% actually, might be impacted sort of in a beneficial way because they're highly complementary with AI. And so what this means is that like just like in the previous slides about the education, this can potentially sort of have some sort of downstream implications for earnings inequality if AI were to become sort of a new form of capital that can by some workers and some firms, maybe larger firms with more access to resources and capital, essentially. But we can't really say anything on inequality just yet because it's only been 2 or 3 years since the proliferation of generative AI. We really haven't don't have any data points yet to see any sort of impact on wage or job growth across these jobs because of AI. So this could, of course, have spillover effects on those unable to take advantage of new technologies. And this is how sort of the AI exposure and complementarity distribution looks like across other demographics. So women, recent immigrants, non-unionized workers, workers in big cities, just to name a few. We have a lot more dimensions covered in the full report, but these are sort of the key ones. Um, these groups are more likely to be highly exposed to AI. Again, I want to reiterate that these differences are driven entirely by the composition or mix of occupations held by these different demographic groups. So to give you a concrete example, there are proportionately more men in the skilled trades, as I question alluded to earlier. So skilled trades, which are less exposed to AI, and more women in office administration, coordination, office support occupations, which are all actually low complementary. So that's one reason why the share of men in highly exposed jobs is significantly lower than women. So it's sort of like a artificially driven due to the composition of jobs. But women are also more likely to be highly complementary with AI, as you could see from this chart, than men, because they tend to work in healthcare and education. So nurses, teachers, which are examples of occupations within industries where a large share of jobs are actually amenable to AI augmentation or the complementary effect. Unionized jobs tend to be in education and healthcare as well. So again, those sectors have a large share of jobs which could potentially benefit from AI. Hence why unionized workers are more likely to be in highly complementary jobs. So higher paid, when we look at the geography, sort of higher paid, highly skilled jobs related to technology tend to be concentrated in urban population centers, which is why we see a higher exposure to AI in big cities. So you could see Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. Um, but again, while this may be interesting, the story really is not so much about the specific demographic groups, but rather the types of jobs they hold. Because at the end of the day, that's exactly what's driving the underlying mechanism that's actually driving these differences. It's not necessarily an individual skill level, because we just don't have a database where we can actually measure like what each individual in in a different job actually do. We're using ONAT information, which is the average task across jobs. So yeah, I'll wrap up shortly. So up to this point, we have really talked a lot about AI and its potential implications. Yep, question?
Yeah, just a quick question. I think a few other people have the same one. In this plot, what's the pink and the red versus light blue?
Sorry, that was just to differentiate the colors to make the categories sort of differentiable. Like
Oh,
there are
okay.
no difference. It's just the red and pink are the same. It's
Oh,
low complementary. I
okay.
just wanted to distinguish the sort of breakdown.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. So like I said, up to this point, we've talked a lot about the AI and its impact on workers because actually the team I work in, we focus on mostly workers and the labor supply side. But we do want to mention something about the other half of this equation, and that's businesses, which are key to all this actually. So they're the ones that'll actually decide whether to deploy AI or not. So our latest data from what's called the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions, suggests that the AI adoption rate was about 6% among private sector businesses at least. It's even lower in the government over the last 2 years, which is actually not surprising if you think about it, given that we are very much sort of in the infancy or early stages of modern AI, generative AI actually. And of course, this take-up rate varies a lot across industries. Finance, professional, scientific services, information industries are more prone to AI usage. The vast majority of AI adopters, this is a key stat, they actually did not reduce their staff. If you focus on the little slivers of red bars there, that represents the slice of the adopters that actually decreased employment. If you notice the green bars, that tells you the slice that actually increased employment after deploying AI. So some sectors did increase employment reported, but the vast majority, as you could see, did not did not see a change in staffing levels actually after deploying AI. Um, but AI usage, there was also a forward-looking question asked on this survey. So AI usage is expected to go up like from 6% now to around 11% this year. We don't know whether that'll happen. That's just reported by firms. So what impact that'll have on employment, we can't really project that right now. Whether the red bars will get bigger and bigger over time, we have no idea. So as AI improves over time, will firms actually accelerate their workforce reduction, workforce increase? We don't know. These things take a long time to unfold. Um, yep. Question.
So these are subjective measures, right? You just
Yes, we really don't have an objective measure of AI adoption by businesses in our data sources. So all we can do is ask businesses what types of AI they used. And this is about a sample of 90,000 businesses, establishments across Canada.
oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
So when we look at the types of AI applications being used by AI adopting businesses, we say that natural language processing, text data analytics, chatbots, and LLMs sort of stand out from the rest of the pack as being the most prevalent. Finance, information, professional, scientific industries tend to have a higher deployment rates than others. You'll notice that some of these applications like machine learning and neural networks, they've actually been around for quite a while now. Like we've heard terms like machine learning since at least 2014, 15. So some of these are more proven examples of applications of AI, while some of these are more recent. Um, I'll point out here that when we talk about AI adoption, at least from our measurement perspective, we're not talking about casual usage of ChatGPT or Copilot by employees. To be considered an AI adopter here in this survey, the businesses must have integrated in some way with these applications with their core day-to-day business operations. So an employee using ChatGPT randomly doesn't count. If you count that, the adoption rate will be much higher. So they're using AI to produce goods and services, basically. But the survey, obviously, due to response burden, doesn't really get into any more details than that. Like they ask, what are you using it for? Producing good services, so on. So the questionnaire is publicly available data on the StatCan website. If you're interested, you could just look up the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. And this was from the second quarter of 2024. When we look at sort of the latest data on barriers to AI adoption from just a few months ago, and this was collected from the third quarter of 2024, the overwhelming majority of businesses report that AI is irrelevant to their business processes and operations. So AI is not being used, not relevant in producing their goods and services. So lack of AI knowledge and AI not being mature enough of a technology are some of the key main sort of barriers, which really isn't all that surprising. AI has advanced at a stunning pace, no doubt, over the last couple of years, and has been adopted by many segments of the society, including students who use it to help them study, do assignments, prepare for exams, and so on. Teachers may use it to create lesson plans, help with grading, so on. But for businesses in the private sector, in order for them to sort of adopt new technologies like this, they need to be confident that AI can actually deliver, boost their performance and productivity, because at the end of the day, that's really what they care about. And in that respect, AI may simply just not be worth it yet for a lot of the businesses. So just a few more slides to go. So Canada, along with several OECD countries, as you know, may have seen a significant slowdown in what's called labor productivity growth over the past 25 years or so. This is something usually measured by what's GDP per hours worked, so the value you produce for the economy every hour. If you watch the economic news or just news in general over the past few years, you would have seen articles which cast this as a crisis for Canada because it affects standard of living. So just to be clear, our productivity in terms of levels is higher than ever, but the concern is that the annual year-over-year sort of growth has slowed relative to some of our peer countries, like the US. Actually, even the US is concerned right now about its own productivity growth. So in Canada's case, many economists have identified the lack of business investment as the main culprit. With the advent of AI, many are wondering whether new technologies can be sort of the silver bullet to our productivity problems. So the late Robert Solow, arguably the most influential macroeconomist, once said, "You could see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics." This was speaking to the sort of idea that although one would expect a massive productivity gain from the advent of the technologies we have, the reality is a lot more different, a bit different. The productivity effects tend to be absorbed rather quickly, and we don't really see the massive gains one would expect. So is AI sort of going to be different now? So there was a study looking at the short-term impact of AI adoption on business productivity, not by us, but the authors did use StatCan data. The data was from the pre-ChatGPT era, so just that's an important distinction here. So they're looking at 2020, 2021. So the results don't reflect the advances that have been made in recent years, but nonetheless, they do provide key insights, such as the fact that they use what's called an event study model. Uh, so the insights they provide is AI adopters were already more productive than other firms, and deploying AI or using AI did not have any significant short-run effects on business productivity. This is perhaps not surprising because when you think about it, AI right now is pretty good at what? Coding, drafting reports, creating music, videos, images, new content, so on. But if you really think about it, those things are a very small portion of the economy. So as AI capabilities grow, perhaps we can see more tangible productivity gains. I'm sure we can find anecdotal evidence of firms gaining an edge thanks to AI, but at a macro level, at least, we haven't seen much movement. So right now, we don't have administrative data from after 2022 because of the lag that we experience at StatCan in getting the sort of tax data from the CRA. So we can't really evaluate what happened after 2022 yet, quite yet, because business productivity is usually an objective measure. It's from their balance sheet. We link it to survey data. So survey data has the AI adoption rate. So that's how we have to study productivity, and that's what these authors did, but obviously from a bit dated data source. So I'll just wrap up here. So we can measure occupational exposure, track AI adoption. AI, at least it's still very much a wild card. Will it be as revolutionary as the PC or the internet all over again? We just don't know its trajectory at the moment. Again, we used one measure called the CAIOE. There are other measures out there, many other measures. So one measure will say X% of jobs are impacted. Another measure will say Y%. It's important to not tunnel vision too much on these exact percentages. The main story is really about in the past, things like automation affected sort of blue collar jobs, manufacturing jobs. But now with the advent of AI, it seems to be casting a wider net in terms of the jobs it can affect. So it's more of the story is more about the types of jobs impacted. But a lot of this obviously also depends on what employers do, whether they deploy AI or not. Experts can offer assessments of what jobs tasks can and cannot be done by AI. But at the end of the day, if employers don't deploy those technologies, we're not sure how this sort of, where this sort of goes, these predictions or projections. There are also sort of other things to be aware of, right? Like when I talk about high complementarity, after our paper came out, there's a paper just, I think, believe from last month. It's a working paper from the US, if you know, the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they found that the complementarity effects of AI might actually be a bad thing for some workers, because as AI makes some parts of their jobs easier, uh, their data shows that their employer puts more demands and adds to some of these workers' workloads. So it could be a deterioration in job quality if your job is highly complementary with AI. Again, this is a working paper, not officially published. So that's just one sort of aspect to be aware of. Like what are the job qualities associated sort of with these different groups of jobs. Again, another thing is, could AI lead to sort of skill erosion? Again, students increasingly turning to AI, sort of over-reliance. Could this sort of lead to a de-skilling of the future workforce where you're so reliant on AI that you don't question or you don't verify what AI is telling you, the outputs that AI is providing? So could that be sort of skill erosion? Is that sort of a big sort of concern in the future? Again, all important questions, but I'm going to leave it there because I do want to get questions. Thanks.
That's great, Toss. And I'm just going to pause the recording and then people can ask questions freely.